The year was 1909, and the small town of Willowbrook was shrouded in an unusual fog that had rolled in from the nearby marshlands. For the past week, the mist had clung to the town like a burial shroud, transforming familiar streets into ghostly passageways where sounds were muffled and shadows seemed to linger a moment too long. The gaslights that lined Main Street struggled to penetrate the dense vapor, creating halos of dim illumination that did little to comfort the town's residents as they hurried about their business, collars turned up and hats pulled low against the unseasonable chill. In a modest two-story home on Elmwood Lane, Elizabeth Harrow sat at her writing desk, carefully penning a letter by lamplight. The yellow glow cast strange patterns on the faded floral wallpaper behind her, and outside the fog pressed against her window like a curious specter. The brass pendulum clock on the mantelpiece ticked away the seconds with a methodical precision that only emphasized the otherwise perfect silence of the house. Elizabeth was 26 years old, unmarried, and employed as a photographer's assistant at Caldwell Photography Studio, one of the few respectable positions available to a woman of her status in Willowbrook. Elizabeth's dark hair was pulled back in a practical chignon, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face, which bore the pallor of someone who spent most daylight hours indoors. Her fingers were slightly stained with chemicals from her work in the darkroom, a badge of her profession that no amount of scrubbing seemed able to remove entirely. The black mourning dress she wore, not for any personal loss, but as a professional courtesy when attending the funeral earlier that day, hung on a hook by the door, replaced now with a simple blue cotton dress that had seen better days. The letter was addressed to her cousin Margaret in Boston. Elizabeth's hand trembled slightly as she wrote, not from the chill that permeated the house despite the small fire in the grate, but from the strange events that had been plaguing her thoughts since that morning. The nib of her pen scratched against the paper, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Dearest Margaret," she wrote, "I hope this letter finds you in good health and spirits. Life in Boston must be so much more stimulating than our quiet existence here in Willowbrook, though I find myself grateful for the tranquility most days. I write to you with news most peculiar, concerning a photograph taken at the funeral of Mr. Arthur Fletcher last Thursday. You may recall Mr. Fletcher was once a prominent businessman in our community, having established the lumber mill that employs half the men in town. His passing was sudden, heart failure they say, though at 62, perhaps not entirely unexpected." Elizabeth paused, the nib of her pen hovering above the cream-colored stationery. How could she possibly explain what she had witnessed? Would Margaret think her mad? She took a deep breath, steadied her hand, and continued, "As you know, I have been employed these past 3 years at Caldwell Photography Studio, where I assist Mr. Caldwell in his various photographic endeavors. My duties range from greeting clients to preparing chemical solutions for the development process, and occasionally assisting with the actual photography when an extra pair of hands is required. It has become customary in Willowbrook, as I suspect it is in Boston, to commission a photograph of the deceased with their family before burial, a memento mori, if you will. The Fletcher family requested such a photograph, and I accompanied Mr. Caldwell to the Fletcher residence on the morning of the funeral. The Fletcher home is one of the grandest in town, a 3-story Victorian with a widow's walk and more gables than one can count easily. Inside, it is filled with treasures from Mr. Fletcher's various business travels, oriental rugs, peculiar statuary from India, and artifacts from places I could not begin to identify. The parlor where the casket was placed had been transformed for the occasion, with black crepe draping the mirrors and windows, and lilies perfuming the air with their heavy scent. The scene was as solemn as one might expect. Mrs. Fletcher, draped in black crepe, stood beside the open casket where Mr. Fletcher lay dressed in his finest suit, a dark gray pinstriped with a silk cravat and his gold pocket watch chain visible across his waistcoat. His hands were folded over a Bible, his wedding ring catching the light from the tall windows. Mrs. Fletcher's face was concealed behind a heavy black veil, though one could sense her grief in the rigid way she held herself. Their children, Robert, Thomas, and Virginia, were arranged behind her, each wearing expressions of appropriate grief. Robert, the eldest at 32, has taken over his father's business interests and stood tall and stoic, a hand on his mother's shoulder. Thomas, 29, seemed more visibly affected, his eyes red-rimmed and his handkerchief clutched tightly in one hand. Virginia, the youngest at 24, leaned slightly against her elder brother, as though requiring his support to remain standing. Mr. Caldwell prepared the camera while I arranged the lighting as we have done countless times before. The apparatus was positioned optimally to capture both the family and the deceased, the black hood ready for Mr. Caldwell to shield his vision from extraneous light when making the exposure. The flash powder was measured precisely, and the glass plate prepared and inserted into the camera with practiced care. All was proceeding as it should. It was when Mr. Caldwell was about to take the exposure that something extraordinary occurred. As I stood beside him, I glanced toward the casket and could swear, though I hesitate to commit this to paper, that Mr. Fletcher's eyes were open and fixed directly on the camera. I gasped, which prompted Mr. Caldwell to delay the exposure and inquire what had startled me. When I looked again, Mr. Fletcher's eyes were closed, his face serene in death as it had been moments before. I dismissed it as a trick of light or perhaps fatigue from the long hours we had been working that week. The Fletcher funeral was the third we had photographed in as many days, and the strain of maintaining a professional demeanor in the face of such grief can be taxing. Mr. Caldwell proceeded with the photograph, and we departed shortly after, leaving the family to their private grief before the burial service. Elizabeth set down her pen and massaged her temples. The headache that had been threatening all day was beginning to take hold, a dull throb behind her eyes that made the lamplight seem unnaturally bright. She rose from her desk and moved to the window, pulling back the lace curtain to peer into the fog-laden street below. The gaslights created small islands of illumination in a sea of mist, their glow diffused and spectral. A lone figure walked slowly past her house, head bowed against the mist, the tap of their walking stick on the cobblestones muffled by the dense air. Elizabeth barely noticed, her mind still preoccupied with what had happened after the funeral. She had not attended the burial itself, having other duties at the studio, but she had heard it had been well attended despite the fog. Arthur Fletcher had been, if not beloved, then certainly respected in Willowbrook. His business practices were sometimes questioned in hushed tones over tea or behind raised newspapers, but never openly challenged. The Fletcher family's influence extended to the town council, the bank, and even the church, where the Fletcher name adorned a stained glass window depicting the Ascension. Returning to her desk, Elizabeth picked up her pen once more. The house creaked and settled around her. The familiar sounds of aged wood and plaster that had once been comforting now somehow ominous in the context of her unsettled thoughts. What troubles me, dear Margaret, is what occurred 2 days later when Mr. Caldwell developed the photograph. He called me into the darkroom, an unusual step, as he typically develops the plates himself, and showed me the image as it appeared in the chemical bath. The darkroom is a small space at the rear of the studio, illuminated only by a red safe light that casts everything in an infernal glow. The chemical odor is always strong there, a mixture of silver nitrate, sodium thiosulfate, and other solutions whose names I have yet to master fully. As the image materialized in the developer tray, I watched the faces of the Fletcher family emerge from the milky emulsion, like ghosts materializing from the ether, and there, amid the mourning family, was Mr. Fletcher in his casket. But Margaret, his eyes were open in the photograph, staring directly at the camera with an intensity that sent a chill through my very soul. Mr. Caldwell was perplexed. He insisted that the corpse's eyes were closed during the exposure, as did I, though I did not mention my momentary vision before the photograph was taken. We examined the plate carefully, holding it up to the red light, studying every detail. There could be no mistake. Arthur Fletcher's eyes were wide open, his gaze penetrating even in death. Mr. Caldwell suggested it must be a flaw in the plate, or perhaps an unusual shadow. The silver emulsion sometimes behaves unpredictably, creating artifacts or unusual patterns that can be misinterpreted. He decided to destroy the plate and apologized to the Fletcher family, claiming a technical error had ruined their memorial photograph. He offered to refund their payment, but Mrs. Fletcher, still deep in grief, said it was of no consequence, and that perhaps it was not meant to be. I might have dismissed the incident entirely, were it not for what happened yesterday. I was organizing Mr. Caldwell's files when I came across an envelope containing a print from the Fletcher funeral. Despite Mr. Caldwell's claim that he had destroyed the plate, here was a print, the very same image with Mr. Fletcher's eyes open, staring out from his casket with that same penetrating gaze. I was so startled I nearly dropped the photograph. When I questioned Mr. Caldwell about it, he appeared genuinely confused. He examined the photograph and insisted that Mr. Fletcher's eyes were closed, as they should be. Margaret, When I looked at the photograph again in his presence, the eyes were indeed closed. I fear for my sanity. Elizabeth stopped writing abruptly as a floorboard creaked somewhere in the house. She lived alone, having inherited the home from her parents who had both succumbed to influenza 2 winters past. The sound was not unusual in the old house, yet tonight it seemed to carry a different quality, deliberate almost. She listened intently for several moments, but heard nothing further. Her gaze fell on the small silver-framed photograph of her parents that sat on her desk. It had been taken on their 25th wedding anniversary, just months before the influenza took them within days of each other. They smiled out at her, frozen in that moment of happiness, unaware of what awaited them. Elizabeth had been devastated by their loss, but the townspeople of Willowbrook had rallied around her, bringing food and offering comfort. Mr. Caldwell had been particularly kind, offering her the position at his studio when he learned she needed to support herself. With a steadying breath, she continued her letter. I have not slept well since the incident. Last night I dreamt I was standing in the Fletcher family parlor beside the casket. The room was as it had been during the funeral, with black crepe and lilies, but I was alone with the deceased. In the dream, Mr. Fletcher's eyes slowly opened, and he turned his head to look directly at me. His lips moved as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, I felt a cold hand grasp my wrist, though Mr. Fletcher's hands remained folded over the Bible in the casket. I awoke in a cold sweat, my heart racing so violently I feared it might burst from my chest. The sensation of that cold grip lingered even after I lit the lamp and assured myself I was alone in my bedroom. I am not one for superstition, as you well know. Our parents raised us to value reason and science above folklore and fancy, but I cannot shake the feeling that something is terribly wrong. The way Mr. Fletcher's eyes stared out from that photograph, as though he were somehow still present, watching, it defies rational explanation. Mr. Caldwell has noticed my distraction and suggested I take a few days' leave to recover my spirits. He believes I am merely overworked and perhaps still processing my grief over our parents. I agreed, though I fear idle hands will only give my mind more freedom to dwell on these disturbing thoughts. Please write soon, dear Margaret. Your rational mind has always been a comfort to me. Perhaps you can suggest some scientific explanation for what I have experienced. I find myself in need of your steady presence, even if only through the written word. Your devoted cousin, Elizabeth. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into an envelope, which she would post in the morning. The clock on the mantel chimed 10, and Elizabeth realized how late it had grown. She tidied her desk, extinguished the lamp, and made her way upstairs to prepare for bed. As she passed the small table in the hallway, her eyes fell upon a stack of photographs she had brought home from the studio, samples of Mr. Caldwell's work to practice her retouching skills. On impulse, she picked up the stack and brought it with her to her bedroom. Elizabeth's bedroom was modest but comfortable, with a brass bed draped with a hand-stitched quilt her mother had made, a cherry-wood dresser with a tilting mirror, and a small writing table beneath the window. A porcelain wash basin and pitcher sat atop a lace doily on the dresser, alongside her hairbrush and a small bottle of lavender water, her one indulgence. The curtains were drawn against the night and the persistent fog, making the room feel like a sanctuary from the strangeness that had invaded her life. Elizabeth changed into her nightgown, a simple white cotton garment with a high collar and long sleeves. She unpinned her hair and brushed it out, the familiar ritual usually calming her. But tonight her nerves remained taut as piano wire. She sat on the edge of her bed, lit the small lamp on her bedside table, and began leafing through the photographs she had brought upstairs. They were innocuous images, a family portrait of the Millers, the new schoolhouse on Maple Street that had been completed in the spring, Mayor Thompson at the cornerstone laying of the town hall. Most were formal compositions, the subjects posed carefully according to convention, their expressions solemn, as was appropriate for the occasion of being photographed. Elizabeth had assisted with many of these sessions, positioning clients, adjusting lighting, preparing plates. She was about to set them aside when something caught her eye. In the corner of the schoolhouse photograph, partially obscured by shadow, was a figure that resembled Arthur Fletcher. The image was small and not entirely clear, but the resemblance was striking. The same proud bearing, the distinctive side whiskers, the high forehead. Impossible, Elizabeth whispered to the empty room. The schoolhouse photograph had been taken in early March, and Mr. Fletcher had been very much alive then. Yet the resemblance was striking. The figure stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, his face turned slightly toward the camera, his eyes, like in the funeral photograph, staring directly at the lens. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine despite the relative warmth of her bedroom. She set the photographs aside on her nightstand and extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the fog and her curtains. She lay down and pulled the quilt up to her chin, trying to quiet her racing thoughts with rational explanations. Perhaps it was simply another man who resembled Mr. Fletcher. Perhaps her mind, preoccupied with the strange funeral photograph, was seeing patterns where none existed. Perhaps. Sleep eluded Elizabeth that night. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. The house creaked and settled around her, ordinary sounds that now seemed laden with sinister significance. The fog pressed against her window, occasionally parting to allow the moon to cast long fingers of silver light across her floor. When she finally drifted off near dawn, her dreams were filled with images of Mr. Fletcher, always watching, always staring directly at her from various photographs, in the school picture, in the funeral portrait, and in other images where he had no business being, including her parents' anniversary photograph where he stood behind them, a dark presence with eyes that seemed to follow her even as she moved in the dreamscape. The following morning, Elizabeth woke to the sound of rain pattering against her window. The fog had given way to a steady downpour that matched her somber mood. She dressed in a simple gray skirt and white shirtwaist, pinned her hair into its usual chignon, and made her way downstairs. The house felt particularly empty this morning, the silence broken only by the tick of the clock and the gentle hiss of rain against the windows. Elizabeth prepared a simple breakfast of toast and tea, but found her appetite had deserted her. She managed a few bites before abandoning the meal and moving to the window to watch the rain transform Elmwood Lane into a river of muddy puddles. After posting her letter to Margaret at the general store on the corner, Elizabeth found herself drawn not back to her empty house, but toward the more affluent part of town where the Fletcher residence stood. She had not planned this detour, but her feet seemed to move of their own accord, carrying her through the rain-slicked streets as though pulled by an invisible thread. The Fletcher residence was one of the finest in Willowbrook, a stately Victorian with a wide porch and ornate trim painted in fashionable shades of burgundy and cream. A wrought iron fence enclosed the property, and a well-maintained garden, now somewhat bedraggled from the persistent rain, surrounded the house. Elizabeth hesitated at the gate, second-guessing her decision, but finally gathered her courage and proceeded up the path to the front door. The brass knocker, shaped like a lion's head, felt unnaturally cold beneath her fingers as she rapped 3 times. A maid in a crisp black uniform with white apron and cap answered her knock and regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Elizabeth realized how improper her visit must seem. A young woman calling unannounced on a family in mourning, with no apparent purpose or prior relationship. "Good morning," Elizabeth said, her voice steadier than she felt. "My name is Elizabeth Harrow. I work at Caldwell Photography Studio. I was hoping I might speak with Mrs. Fletcher for a moment to express my condolences personally." The maid hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to admit her, but eventually nodded and stepped aside. "Wait in the entry, please. I'll inquire if Mrs. Fletcher is receiving visitors." Elizabeth stood in the grand entry hall of the Fletcher home, feeling distinctly out of place. The floor was polished marble, and a crystal chandelier hung from the high ceiling, casting prismatic patterns on the walls. A large mirror in an ornate gold frame dominated one wall, and Elizabeth caught sight of her reflection, her damp hair, her simple attire, her pale face with its expression of barely concealed anxiety. She looked away quickly, uncomfortable with the image of herself in such opulent surroundings. After what seemed an eternity, the maid returned and led her to the parlor where Mrs. Fletcher sat alone, dressed in black, a handkerchief clutched in her pale hands. The room was dim, heavy curtains drawn against the gray day outside, a single lamp burning on a side table. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies, several large arrangements still present from the funeral. The casket was gone, but Elizabeth could almost see its outline on the Turkish carpet where it had stood just days before. "Miss Harrow," Mrs. Fletcher said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How kind of you to call. Please sit." Elizabeth perched on the edge of an upholstered chair across from the widow. "I hope I'm not intruding, Mrs. Fletcher. I wanted to express my condolences personally. Mr. Caldwell and I were both so sorry about the issue with the photograph. These technical failures are rare but most unfortunate when they occur. Mrs. Fletcher nodded, dabbing at her eyes with the handkerchief. These things happen, I suppose. Were you acquainted with my husband? Not well, ma'am, Elizabeth admitted. Only through my work at the photography studio. I was present when Mr. Caldwell took the memorial photograph. At the mention of the photograph, something changed in Mrs. Fletcher's expression. A slight tightening around her eyes, a tensing of her shoulders. The change was subtle but unmistakable to Elizabeth, who had been trained to observe closely when composing photographic portraits. Ah, yes, the photograph that was supposedly ruined, she said. A pity. I had hoped for one last image of Arthur to keep with me, though perhaps it's for the best. Photographs capture only a moment after all. They cannot truly preserve what we have lost. Elizabeth hesitated. Mrs. Fletcher, may I ask, had Mr. Fletcher been ill before his passing? Mr. Caldwell mentioned it was sudden. Mrs. Fletcher's fingers worried the edge of her handkerchief, the fine lace fraying slightly under her nervous movement. Arthur had always been in robust health. He prided himself on it, in fact. Took a cold bath every morning, even in winter. Walked 3 miles a day, regardless of weather. The doctor said his heart simply gave out. A blessing, really, to go so quickly without suffering. She paused, studying Elizabeth's face. Why do you ask, Miss Harrow? Mere curiosity, Elizabeth replied hastily. It's always a shock when someone passes unexpectedly. Indeed, Mrs. Fletcher said, though her tone suggested she didn't quite believe Elizabeth's explanation. Arthur was particular about certain things. His appearance, for one. He would not have appreciated being remembered as he looked in death. Perhaps it's for the best. The photograph was ruined. There was something in Mrs. Fletcher's words that struck Elizabeth as odd, but before she could consider it further, the parlor door opened, and Robert Fletcher, the eldest son, entered. He was tall like his father, with the same authoritative bearing, though his features were softer, more like his mother's. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, his collar starched to rigid perfection. Mother, Reverend Simmons has arrived to discuss. He stopped short upon seeing Elizabeth. I beg your pardon. I didn't realize we had a visitor. Miss Harrow from Caldwell Photography, Mrs. Fletcher explained. She came to offer her condolences. Robert Fletcher was a tall man in his early 30s, with his father's strong jaw and penetrating gaze, but without the severe lines that had marked the elder Fletcher's countenance. His hair was dark, with just a touch of silver at the temples, despite his relatively young age. He bowed slightly to Elizabeth. How thoughtful. Were you the assistant present when the photograph was taken? I was, Mr. Fletcher. Robert exchanged a look with his mother that Elizabeth couldn't interpret. There seemed to be a silent communication between them, some understanding that excluded her. Unfortunate business with the photograph. Mr. Caldwell explained it was some sort of technical failure. Yes, Elizabeth said carefully. Sometimes the chemicals react unpredictably, or the plate may have a flaw that isn't visible until development. Mr. Caldwell was quite distressed about it. He prides himself on his technical precision. Robert nodded, though his expression remained guarded. There was something assessing in his gaze as he looked at her, as though he were trying to determine how much she knew or suspected. Father was a private man. I suspect he wouldn't have approved of such a photograph in any case. If you'll excuse me, I'll tell Reverend Simmons that Mother will be with him shortly. After Robert left, an uncomfortable silence fell between the two women. Elizabeth sensed she had overstayed her welcome and rose to her feet. I should be going, Mrs. Fletcher. Again, please accept my condolences for your loss. Mrs. Fletcher stood as well, smoothing the folds of her black dress. Her movements were graceful despite her age, which Elizabeth guessed to be around 55. She was still a handsome woman, with high cheekbones and clear blue eyes that must once have been quite striking. Grief had etched new lines around her mouth and between her brows, but it hadn't diminished her inherent dignity. Miss Harrow, before you go, you seem troubled. Is there something specific about Arthur's passing that concerns you? Elizabeth felt her cheeks flush. No, not at all. It's just, Mr. Caldwell has never had a plate fail in quite that way before. It was unusual. How did it fail precisely? Mrs. Fletcher's gaze was unnervingly direct. I'm not certain of the technical details, Elizabeth lied. Mr. Caldwell handles the development process. Mrs. Fletcher took a step closer to Elizabeth. Miss Harrow, did you see something in that photograph? Something unexpected? Elizabeth's heart began to race. I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Fletcher. I think you do. Mrs. Fletcher's voice had lost its fragility, taking on a harder edge. Arthur was a man with secrets, Miss Harrow. Some secrets are best buried with the dead. I really must be going, Elizabeth said, moving toward the door. Good day, Mrs. Fletcher. The maid showed her out, and Elizabeth hurried down the path to the gate, the rain soaking through her light coat and dampening her hair. She could feel Mrs. Fletcher's eyes on her back as she left, though when she glanced over her shoulder, the curtains in the parlor window were drawn shut once more. The rain had intensified as Elizabeth hurried away from the Fletcher house, her mind whirling with questions. Mrs. Fletcher's behavior had been strange, almost threatening. And what had she meant about secrets being buried with the dead? The ordinary explanation would be that the family had some embarrassment they wished to conceal, financial difficulties perhaps, or an illness that carried a social stigma. But Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister at work, something connected to the unnatural photograph of Arthur Fletcher with his eyes open, staring at the camera from his casket. Instead of returning home, Elizabeth made her way to the town library. If there was something unusual about Arthur Fletcher or his family, perhaps there would be some record of it in the newspaper archives. The Willowbrook Gazette had been in continuous publication since 1860, and the library maintained a complete archive. The library was a handsome brick building on Main Street, one of the few public structures in Willowbrook that could rival the Fletcher home in grandeur. Inside, the air was pleasantly warm and dry, with the comforting smell of leather bindings and paper that Elizabeth had always loved. The library was nearly empty, save for the elderly librarian, Miss Prentice, who nodded to Elizabeth as she entered. Her steel-gray hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her pince-nez glasses gleamed in the lamplight as she looked up from her ledger. "Good afternoon, Miss Harrow," she said in her precise, quiet voice. "You're out and about in dreadful weather today." "Research waits for no one, Miss Prentice," Elizabeth replied with a smile. "I was hoping to consult the newspaper archives, if I may." "Of course, my dear. Any particular subject of interest?" Elizabeth had prepared her answer. "I'm researching local business development for Mr. Caldwell. He's considering a series of photographs documenting Willowbrook's commercial growth, particularly Mr. Fletcher's lumber mill, given its significance to the local economy." Miss Prentice seemed satisfied with this explanation and directed Elizabeth to the archive room at the rear of the library. "The newspapers are bound by year and shelved chronologically. Feel free to use the reading table. I've just lit the lamps, so the light should be adequate." The newspaper archives were kept in a small, windowless room lined with shelves holding leather-bound volumes. A large oak table occupied the center of the space, with 2 chairs and a desk lamp providing a workspace. Elizabeth began with the current year, 1909, and worked backward, methodically examining each volume. For the first hour, she found nothing particularly noteworthy. Articles about the lumber mill's success, mentions of the Fletcher family at various social events, the occasional philanthropic gesture such as Mr. Fletcher's donation toward the new church bell or the family's sponsorship of the annual Founders' Day celebration. The Fletcher name appeared frequently, but always in contexts that reinforced their status as respected, prosperous citizens of Willowbrook. It wasn't until she reached the bound volume for 1897 that something caught her eye. A small article, tucked away on page 6 of the Willowbrook Gazette, dated November 12, 1897. "Tragic accident at Fletcher Mill, worker perishes in machinery." A tragic accident occurred yesterday at Fletcher Lumber when mill worker James Hollis, 42, became entangled in the new steam-powered saw. Mr. Hollis, who had been employed at the mill for 15 years, died instantly. Mill owner Arthur Fletcher expressed profound regret at the incident and announced that safety measures would be implemented immediately to prevent future tragedies. Mr. Fletcher has offered financial assistance to the Hollis family, who survive him. Elizabeth frowned. A workplace accident, while unfortunate, was not uncommon in such dangerous occupations. The lumber industry was notoriously hazardous, with injuries and even deaths occurring with distressing regularity. Still, she made note of the name James Hollis and continued her search. She found 2 more articles about accidents at the Fletcher Mill over the next 5 years. One man crushed by falling logs in 1899, another who lost an arm to a saw in 1902. Again, nothing particularly unusual for a lumber operation, though the frequency was perhaps higher than one might expect from a business owner who claimed to value safety. Then, in a March 1903 edition, she found something that made her blood run cold. Photographer found dead, apparent suicide shocks community. The body of Daniel Winters, 35, proprietor of Winters Photography, was discovered yesterday in his studio by a client arriving for a scheduled sitting. According to Chief Constable Warren, Mr. Winters appears to have ingested a fatal quantity of potassium cyanide, a chemical commonly used in photographic processes. No note was found, leaving the motive for his desperate act unknown. Mr. Winters was a respected member of the community, having established his photography business 5 years ago after moving to Willowbrook from Chicago. His portraits were highly regarded, and his studio had become popular among the town's more affluent families. He was unmarried and is survived by an elderly mother in Chicago. Mr. Winters had recently completed a commission for prominent businessman Arthur Fletcher, photographing the new equipment installed at Fletcher Lumber. The photographs, which were to be used in the mill's promotional materials, were found torn to pieces in Mr. Winters' darkroom. Mr. Fletcher expressed shock at the news, stating, "Mr. Winters seemed in good spirits when he visited the mill last week. I cannot imagine what might have driven him to such an act. My heart goes out to his poor mother in her time of grief." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she carefully turned the pages, searching for any follow-up articles about Daniel Winters. There was only a brief mention of his funeral, attended primarily by business associates rather than friends, and the sale of his photography equipment. His studio had been purchased by none other than Edward Caldwell, who had moved to Willowbrook from Philadelphia shortly after, establishing Caldwell Photography in the same location on Main Street. The connection might be coincidental, but combined with her experience with the Fletcher funeral photograph, Elizabeth couldn't dismiss the growing sense of unease that twisted in her stomach like a live thing. A photographer who had worked with Fletcher had died mysteriously, and another photographer, her employer, had immediately taken his place. And now she, a photographer's assistant, had seen something strange in a photograph of Fletcher's corpse. Elizabeth copied the articles into her notebook, the pencil scratching softly on the paper. She continued her search, looking now for any mentions of unusual deaths or incidents connected to Arthur Fletcher or his family. In a July 1904 edition, she found another article that gave her pause. Local doctor missing Dr. Henry Abernathy last seen Tuesday. Concern grows for the whereabouts of Dr. Henry Abernathy, who has not been seen since Tuesday last. Dr. Abernathy, who has served as Willowbrook's physician for nearly 20 years, missed several appointments on Wednesday, prompting his housekeeper to alert authorities. Chief Constable Warren reports that Dr. Abernathy's home was found in good order, with no signs of struggle or forced entry. His medical bag and horse are also missing, suggesting he may have left to attend to a patient. However, no one has come forward to claim having summoned the doctor on Tuesday evening. Dr. Abernathy recently treated Mr. Arthur Fletcher for an unspecified ailment, making several house calls to the Fletcher residence in the past month. When questioned, Mr. Fletcher stated that he had not seen the doctor since his final visit last Saturday, when Abernathy pronounced him fully recovered. The article continued on the next page, but as Elizabeth turned to it, she was startled by a hand on her shoulder. She gasped and spun around to find Robert Fletcher standing behind her. "Miss Harrow," he said, his voice low. "What an unexpected pleasure to find you here." Elizabeth closed the newspaper volume quickly, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it. "Mr. Fletcher, you startled me. My apologies." His smile didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and assessing. "Miss Prentice mentioned you were researching the lumber mill. As the new owner, I'm naturally curious about your interest." "Mere professional curiosity," Elizabeth said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mr. Caldwell often photographs local businesses for advertisements. I thought I might familiarize myself with the history of prominent establishments in town. It helps when composing the photographic narrative, you see." Robert's gaze dropped to the closed volume in front of her. 1904? You're going back quite a ways. The mill has modernized considerably since then. New bandsaws, improved safety features, more efficient boilers for the steam engines. "A thorough understanding requires a broad perspective," Elizabeth replied, unconsciously echoing her father's favorite phrase. Her father had been a school teacher before his death, and he had valued comprehensive knowledge on any subject. History informs the present, after all. Robert nodded, though his expression suggested he found her explanation lacking. "Indeed, though some aspects of the past are best left undisturbed, wouldn't you agree? Like disturbing a grave, nothing good ever comes of it." The analogy sent a chill through Elizabeth. "I'm not disturbing anything, Mr. Fletcher. Merely reading public records." "Of course." He gestured to her notebook. "Finding anything of interest?" Elizabeth gathered her notebook, conscious of the articles she had copied. Nothing out of the ordinary. The lumber industry has a fascinating history in this region. Your father was quite the visionary, implementing new technologies ahead of his competitors. He was indeed. Robert's voice contained a note of genuine pride. Father always said that a man must evolve or perish. He applied that philosophy to business and to personal matters as well. A sound philosophy, Elizabeth agreed, rising from her chair. If you'll excuse me, Mr. Fletcher, I should be getting back to the studio. Mr. Caldwell will be wondering where I've gone. Robert stepped aside to let her pass, but his voice stopped her before she reached the door. Miss Harrow, my father valued his privacy greatly. Our family continues to honor that preference. I would hate to see anyone misled by old gossip or misunderstandings about the Fletcher name. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Elizabeth nodded stiffly. I assure you, Mr. Fletcher, I have no interest in gossip. Good day to you. She hurried from the library, the rain having subsided to a light drizzle. Rather than returning to the studio as she had claimed, she went directly home, locking the door behind her. Her nerves were stretched to breaking point, and she needed time to think, to process what she had discovered. In the safety of her sitting room, Elizabeth reviewed the notes she had taken. The deaths connected to Arthur Fletcher might be coincidental, but her instincts suggested otherwise. The photographer's suicide, the missing doctor, the mill accidents, and now the strange funeral photograph with the dead man's eyes open, staring into the camera. There was a pattern here, though she couldn't yet discern its full shape. A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. She hesitated, then moved to the window and peered out. Edward Caldwell stood on her porch, his expression troubled, his hat in his hands. The sight of her employer outside her home was unexpected and somewhat improper. A bachelor calling on a single woman. But Elizabeth's curiosity overcame her concern for propriety. She tucked her notebook into a drawer before answering the door. Mr. Caldwell, this is unexpected. Caldwell removed his hat, revealing his thinning gray hair. At 55, he had the worn look of a man who had seen much in his lifetime. Deep lines etched the corners of his eyes and mouth, and his shoulders stooped slightly as though under an invisible burden. His clothes were of good quality but somewhat outdated in style, as though fashion held little interest for him. May I come in, Miss Harrow? There's a matter of some urgency I need to discuss with you. Elizabeth hesitated, then stepped aside. The impropriety of receiving a male visitor alone was outweighed by her need for answers, and perhaps Caldwell had come to provide them. She led him to the sitting room and offered tea, which he declined. Once they were seated, Caldwell came directly to the point. His directness, one of the qualities Elizabeth had always appreciated in her employer. I received a visit from Robert Fletcher this afternoon. He seemed to believe you have been asking questions about his father and the family business. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. Robert had wasted no time in reporting their encounter at the library. I was merely doing some historical research, she said carefully, for potential photographic projects. Caldwell sighed, rubbing his forehead wearily. His fingers were stained like Elizabeth's, the indelible mark of their shared profession. Elizabeth, I've known you for 3 years. You're an intelligent woman, not given to flights of fancy or idle curiosity. But I must caution you against pursuing this matter further. The Fletchers are a powerful family in Willowbrook. They can make life very difficult for those who cross them. Is that what happened to Daniel Winters? Elizabeth asked directly. Caldwell's face paled. Where did you hear that name? In the newspaper archives. He was a photographer who died after taking pictures for Arthur Fletcher. And then you arrived in town and took over his studio. Elizabeth leaned forward, watching Caldwell's reaction closely. Did you know him? Is that why you came to Willowbrook? That's merely coincidence, Caldwell insisted, though his discomfort was evident in the way he shifted in his chair, his hands fidgeting with the brim of his hat. Winter's death was tragic, but it had nothing to do with the Fletchers or with me. I heard of the opportunity from a colleague in Philadelphia, a studio available in a prosperous town. It was a fortunate chance for a man looking to establish himself in a smaller community. And what about Dr. Abernathy? He went missing after treating Mr. Fletcher. Another coincidence? Elizabeth, please. Caldwell leaned forward, his voice urgent. These are dangerous waters you're treading. I came here as a friend to warn you. Whatever you think you know about Arthur Fletcher, let it rest. The man is dead and buried. Is he? Elizabeth challenged. Then how do you explain the funeral photograph? His eyes were open, Mr. Caldwell. He was looking directly at the camera, at us. You saw it too. I know you did. Caldwell stood abruptly, his agitation evident in his jerky movements. I told you that was a flaw in the plate. Nothing more. Sometimes the silver emulsion creates anomalies. Shadows where there should be light. Light where there should be shadow. It's a chemical process, not an exact science. You made a print from that flawed plate, Elizabeth countered. I found it in your files. And when I showed it to you, suddenly the eyes were closed again. How is that possible? How can a photograph change depending on who's looking at it? You're overtired imagining things, Caldwell said, moving toward the door. Take a few days' rest, as I suggested. Clear your mind of these fantasies. They're not fantasies. Elizabeth rose to her feet, her voice stronger now, fueled by frustration and a growing certainty that she was right. Something strange is happening, Mr. Caldwell, and I believe you know more than you're telling me. Did Arthur Fletcher have something to do with Daniel Winters's death? Is that why you came to Willowbrook? Because you knew something about Fletcher? Caldwell's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. Good evening, Miss Harrow. I hope when I see you next, you'll have put these notions behind you, for your own sake. He hesitated, then added in a softer tone, not everyone who looks too deeply into the Fletcher's affairs lives to share what they discover. With that ominous statement, he departed, leaving Elizabeth staring after him, her mind racing with new questions and fears. The implication was clear. Caldwell was warning her away not merely to protect the Fletcher family's reputation, but because he genuinely believed she might be in danger. After Caldwell left, Elizabeth paced her sitting room, her mind racing. The steady patter of rain on her windows and the occasional rumble of distant thunder provided a somber backdrop to her troubled thoughts. Caldwell's reaction had only confirmed her suspicions that there was more to Arthur Fletcher's story than appeared on the surface. But what was the connection to the funeral photograph? Why would a dead man's eyes be open in an image, then closed when viewed again? As the afternoon waned into evening, Elizabeth lit the lamps in her sitting room and retrieved her notebook from the drawer. She reviewed her notes, trying to connect the disparate pieces of information into a coherent narrative. The mill accidents, the photographer's suicide, the missing doctor, and now the funeral photograph. There had to be a pattern, a thread that tied these events together. On an impulse, she decided to visit the town cemetery where Arthur Fletcher had been buried. Perhaps standing at his grave would help her make sense of the puzzle, or at least convince her that the man was truly dead and gone. Elizabeth donned her coat and took an umbrella from the stand by the door. The rain had tapered to a fine mist, but the sky remained heavy with clouds, and darkness was falling rapidly. She knew it was foolish to venture out alone at such an hour, but her need for answers outweighed her caution. The Willowbrook Cemetery occupied a hillside at the edge of town, its wrought iron gates standing open even as dusk approached. A caretaker's cottage stood just inside the entrance, a lamp burning in its window the only sign of habitation. The gravel paths wound between ancient oaks and elms, their branches casting long shadows in the fading light. Elizabeth made her way along the paths to the newer section where recent burials had taken place. The Fletcher plot was easy to find. A large marble monument marked the family site, with generations of Fletchers interred there. The plot was surrounded by a low wrought iron fence, and a stone angel stood guard at its entrance, its wings spread as though to protect the deceased from worldly intrusions. Several of the older graves bore elaborate headstones with Victorian motifs, weeping willows, broken columns, and clasped hands symbolizing earthly farewells and heavenly reunions. Arthur Fletcher's grave was fresh, the earth still mounded, a temporary wooden marker in place until the stone could be carved. Several floral arrangements, now wilting in the damp air, surrounded the grave, their sweet scent mingling with the earthy smell of recently turned soil. Elizabeth stood before it, feeling slightly foolish. What had she expected to find? A disturbed grave? Arthur Fletcher himself, risen from the dead? The cemetery was silent save for the occasional call of a nightbird and the whisper of mist through the trees. He's not there, you know. The voice behind her nearly stopped her heart. Elizabeth whirled around to face an elderly man leaning on a shovel, the cemetery caretaker judging by his dirt-stained clothes and weathered appearance. His face was deeply lined, his eyes rheumy with age, but there was a sharpness to his gaze that suggested a mind still alert despite his years. "I beg your pardon?" Elizabeth managed to say. The old man nodded toward Arthur Fletcher's grave. "Empty casket. Just rocks inside to give it weight." That's absurd," Elizabeth stammered. "I saw Mr. Fletcher in his casket at the funeral." The entire town attended the service. The caretaker shrugged, his shoulders rising and falling beneath his worn jacket. Saw what they wanted you to see, I reckon. But I've been digging graves here 40 years. I know the weight of a man in a casket. That one, he pointed with his shovel, didn't have no body in it. How can you be so certain? Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 'Cause I helped bury the real Arthur Fletcher 12 years ago, the old man said matter-of-factly. In a pauper's grave on the north side, unmarked. Man who died last week. Don't know who he was, but weren't Arthur Fletcher. Elizabeth's mind reeled. That's impossible. Everyone in town knew Arthur Fletcher. He owned the lumber mill. He was at public events. He looked like Arthur Fletcher, sure enough. The caretaker interrupted. Maybe even believed he was Fletcher. But the real one's been dead since 97. 1897, Elizabeth whispered. The year of the first accident at the mill. The caretaker nodded, his rheumy eyes gleaming in the twilight. James Hollis. Good man. Wasn't no accident, though. Fletcher murdered him, plain and simple. Saw it myself from the tool shed. Pushed him right into the saw. He spat on the ground. Course nobody'd take the word of old Ezra Jenkins over Arthur Fletcher's. But God sees the truth, miss, even when men don't. If the real Arthur Fletcher died in 1897, then who has been living as Arthur Fletcher all these years? Elizabeth asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. James Hollis, Ezra Jenkins said grimly. Least what was left of him after he made some kind of deal. Don't know how he did it. Witchcraft, devil worship, who can say? But I seen him that night, standing over Fletcher's body, different somehow. And the next day, Arthur Fletcher was back at the mill like nothing happened, and James Hollis was reported dead in an accident. Elizabeth remembered the newspaper article about James Hollis's death, but Hollis had a family. Surely they would have recognized. Hollis' family left town right after. Fletcher, or whatever was wearing his face, gave him money to go. Convenient, wasn't it? And ain't nobody questioned it. Money has a way of silencing questions in a town like this. The old man's story was fantastical, impossible. Yet it would explain so much. The strange funeral photograph, the mysterious deaths connected to Fletcher and Caldwell's nervous behavior. And the photographer? Daniel Winters? Elizabeth asked. And Dr. Abernathy. They saw something they shouldn't, Jenkins said, his voice dropping to a whisper, though there was no one else in the cemetery to hear. Winters took photographs at the mill. Don't know what he captured on his plates, but the next day he was dead. Abernathy was called to the Fletcher house when the old man, or whatever he is, took sick. Doc spent 3 days there, never seen again. A chill wind swept through the cemetery, rustling the leaves on the trees and causing Elizabeth's umbrella to sway in her grip. In the fading light, shadows lengthened across the graves, taking on sinister shapes in the gathering darkness. Why are you telling me this? Elizabeth asked. Why now, after all these years? The old man's rheumy eyes fixed on her face. Because you saw something in that photograph, didn't you? Something that weren't right. Just like Daniel Winters did and Doc Abernathy before they silenced them. Whatever's wearing Fletcher's face now, it ain't human no more. And it ain't dead neither. Before Elizabeth could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path made them both turn. Robert Fletcher and 2 men she didn't recognize were walking purposefully toward them. Even in the dim light, Elizabeth could see the anger in Robert's stride, the determination in his expression. You best go, miss, Ezra Jenkins whispered urgently. And whatever you do, don't trust Caldwell. He's been in it from the start. Elizabeth didn't wait to be told twice. She hurried away from the Fletcher plot, taking a side path that led behind a large mausoleum. From there, she circled back toward the cemetery gates, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced back once to see Robert Fletcher confronting the old caretaker, their voices raised in argument, though she couldn't make out the words. By the time she reached the gates, night had fallen completely. The lamp in the caretaker's cottage still burned, a beacon in the darkness. But Elizabeth didn't dare stop to seek help. She wasn't certain whom she could trust anymore. If Ezra Jenkins was right about Caldwell, then her employer, the man she had worked alongside for 3 years, was somehow involved in the strange events surrounding the Fletcher family. Elizabeth hurried through the darkened streets of Willowbrook, jumping at every sound, the distant barking of a dog, the crunch of her own footsteps on the wet gravel, the rustle of wind through the trees. The few street lamps cast pools of yellow light at intervals, but between them lay stretches of impenetrable shadow. The old caretaker's story was fantastic, impossible, yet it would explain the strange funeral photograph, the mysterious deaths connected to Fletcher and Caldwell's nervous behavior. If what Ezra Jenkins said was true, then whatever had been buried in Arthur Fletcher's grave wasn't James Hollis either. But then, who was in the casket she had photographed? And why had its eyes opened in the photograph? As she approached her home, Elizabeth noticed a light burning in her sitting room window. She was certain she had extinguished all lamps before leaving. Someone was inside her house. Instead of going to her front door, Elizabeth crept around to the back of the house and peered through the kitchen window. Edward Caldwell was in her sitting room, rifling through the drawer where she had hidden her notebook. As she watched, he found it and began reading through her notes, his expression grim in the lamplight. Elizabeth's first instinct was to confront him, to demand answers about his connection to the Fletcher family and the strange events she had uncovered. But caution prevailed. If Ezra Jenkins was right, if Caldwell was in it from the start, then confronting him alone might be dangerous, even fatal. Elizabeth knew she couldn't return home. Not now. But where could she go? Who could she trust? The constable? But if the Fletchers were as powerful as everyone suggested, would he even believe her wild tale of body snatching and unnatural photographs? Her cousin Margaret in Boston? But the journey would take days, and she had no money for a hotel in the meantime. She decided her only option was to gather proof, something concrete that would validate the caretaker's story and her own suspicions. And for that, she needed to return to the photography studio. Caldwell Photography Studio occupied a small storefront on Main Street, sandwiched between the milliner's shop and the druggist's. The plate glass window displayed samples of Caldwell's work: formal portraits, wedding photographs, landscape views of local beauty spots. The sign above the door was elegantly lettered in gold: Caldwell Photography, Portraits, Events, Landscapes. As Caldwell's assistant, Elizabeth had a key, which she used now to let herself in through the back door that opened onto the alley behind the row of shops. The studio was dark and silent, smelling of chemicals and paper. Elizabeth lit a small lamp, keeping the flame low to avoid being seen from outside. The front room of the studio was where clients were received, a comfortably furnished space with plush chairs, framed photographs on the walls, and a large mirror that allowed sitters to check their appearance before being photographed. Through a door at the rear was the photography room itself, with its backdrop cloths, reflectors, and the large camera on its tripod. Various props were arranged neatly against one wall: columns, ornate chairs, painted backdrops of pastoral scenes, and elegant interiors. The dark room was at the rear of the studio, a windowless space where Caldwell developed his photographs. Elizabeth slipped inside, closing the door before raising the lamp higher. The red safe light cast an eerie glow over the trays of chemicals and drying racks. The familiar smell of developer and fixer solutions was stronger here, a pungent reminder of the alchemy that transformed exposed plates into permanent images. Elizabeth knew what she was looking for: the original glass plate from Arthur Fletcher's funeral. Caldwell had claimed to have destroyed it, but he had kept a print. Perhaps the plate still existed as well. She searched methodically through the shelves of stored plates, each carefully wrapped in paper and labeled with the subject and date. Caldwell was meticulous in his organization, a quality Elizabeth had always admired until now. And there, near the back of the highest shelf, she found it, a plate labeled simply "Fletcher Funeral, May 1909. With trembling hands, Elizabeth unwrapped the plate and held it up to the safe light. The negative image was ghostly: white where the positive would be dark, dark where it would be light. But even in negative, she could clearly see Arthur Fletcher's eyes were open, staring directly at the camera with an intensity that made Elizabeth shiver despite the warmth of the small room. As she studied the image, Elizabeth noticed something she hadn't seen before. In the background, partially obscured by Virginia Fletcher's mourning veil, was a mirror on the parlor wall. And in that mirror, reflected clearly despite the limitations of the photographic process, was her own face, and beside her, Edward Caldwell. But Caldwell's reflection was wrong. His features were distorted, elongated, barely human. Elizabeth nearly dropped the plate in shock. She wrapped it carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket. Whatever was happening in Willowbrook, whatever strange secret the Fletchers and Caldwell were hiding, this plate was proof that something unnatural was occurring. The distorted reflection couldn't be explained by a chemical flaw or a trick of the light. She was about to leave the dark room when she heard the front door of the studio open. Heavy footsteps moved through the outer room, and a voice called out, "Miss Harrow, I know you're here." The lamp in the window gives you away. Robert Fletcher. Elizabeth extinguished her lamp immediately and pressed herself against the dark room wall, hardly daring to breathe. The doorknob turned slowly, and the door began to open. Elizabeth. It was Caldwell's voice now, gentle, cajoling. Please come out. We only want to talk to you, to explain. You've been asking dangerous questions, Robert Fletcher added. But it's not too late. You can still be part of this. Like Caldwell, like my father. Elizabeth remained silent, her hand clutching the glass plate in her pocket. The door opened wider, and in the dim light from the outer room she could see Robert Fletcher's silhouette, tall and imposing. We know about your visit to the cemetery, he said, about your conversation with that addled old caretaker. Whatever he told you, it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth? Elizabeth found her voice at last. Was any of it true? Was your father really Arthur Fletcher? Was he really dead in that casket? Robert stepped into the dark room, Caldwell behind him. The red safe light illuminated their faces strangely, casting deep shadows that made them appear almost monstrous. My father lived many lives, Miss Harrow. Arthur Fletcher was just one of them. And no, what you saw in the casket wasn't him. Not anymore. It was just a shell he no longer needed. Then where is he now? Elizabeth demanded. And what are you? What is Mr. Caldwell? We are the future, Miss Harrow, Caldwell said softly. We are what humanity could become, freed from the constraints of mortality. Arthur Fletcher discovered the secret decades ago in his travels to the Orient. He brought it back to America, and he shared it with those he deemed worthy. Shared what? Some kind of immortality? Robert Fletcher smiled, but it wasn't a human expression. It stretched too wide, revealed too many teeth. Not immortality, transference. The ability to move from one body to another when the current vessel becomes unsuitable. Elizabeth felt sick. The accidents at the mill, the photographer's suicide, the missing doctor, those were all vessels? Candidates, Caldwell corrected. Not all were suitable. The process is selective. It requires a certain compatibility and willingness in some cases. And the funeral photograph? Why were his eyes open? A moment of transition, Robert explained. The essence that was my father, moving to its new home. The camera captured what the human eye couldn't perceive. It happens sometimes with photography. The lens sees more than we do. It's why my father was always cautious around cameras. But at the funeral, well, we thought it safe. He was supposed to be dead after all. Elizabeth's hand closed around the glass plate in her pocket. And now you want me to be a candidate? Caldwell stepped forward, his face earnest in the dim light. You have talent, Elizabeth. An eye for composition, a technical skill with the camera. You could continue my work when this body fails. You could live for centuries, experiencing history as it unfolds. Think of it, as a parasite, stealing other people's bodies? Elizabeth's voice rose with disgust. Murdering innocent people for your own benefit? Not murder, Robert said dismissively. Evolution, the strong replacing the weak. It's the natural order of things. My father understood this, he continued, his voice taking on a reverent quality. He was a man ahead of his time. In Tibet, he studied with masters who had preserved ancient knowledge, techniques that Western science can't begin to comprehend. They taught him that the body is merely a vessel, a temporary housing for the consciousness. Most humans are trapped in a single vessel from birth to death, but we have learned to transcend that limitation. Elizabeth knew she had to escape, had to get the photographic plate to someone who would believe her. But Robert and Caldwell blocked the doorway, and there was no other exit from the dark room. The chemical trays behind her offered no weapon, no means of defense against whatever these creatures were. I need time, she said, feigning consideration. This is overwhelming. I don't know what to think. Caldwell and Robert exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Of course, Caldwell said finally. It's a lot to absorb. Take the night to consider our offer. We'll speak again tomorrow. They stepped back, allowing her to exit the dark room. Elizabeth moved cautiously, keeping the plate hidden in her coat. Her mind raced, searching for an escape route. The front door was too obvious, but perhaps the back. You won't leave town, will you, Miss Harrow? Robert's question was phrased politely, but the menace behind it was clear. Where would I go? Elizabeth replied. My life is here in Willowbrook. Good, Robert said, smiling that too wide smile again. Mother is eager to meet with you properly. She sees great potential in you. As they escorted her to the studio door, Elizabeth's mind raced. She needed to escape, to find help. But who would believe such an outlandish tale? And if the Fletchers and Caldwell were as powerful as they seemed, how far could she really run? The moment she stepped outside the studio, Elizabeth made her decision. Instead of turning toward her home, she bolted in the opposite direction, toward the train station. If she could reach the last evening train to Boston, she might escape. She could go to Margaret, show her the photographic plate, perhaps even find a bigger newspaper that would investigate the strange events in Willowbrook. She heard shouts behind her as Caldwell and Robert realized her deception, but she didn't look back. Her lungs burned as she ran through the darkened streets, the glass plate a heavy weight in her pocket. The wet cobblestones were slippery beneath her boots, and once she nearly fell, catching herself against a lamppost before pushing on. The train station was at the edge of town, a 10-minute walk under normal circumstances, but Elizabeth reached it in half that time, driven by fear and desperation. The small brick building was illuminated by a single electric lamp, the platform deserted save for the station master closing up for the night. Elizabeth burst through the door, startling the elderly man who was preparing to lock the ticket window. "The Boston train. Has it departed?" she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. The station master checked his pocket watch, a gesture that seemed agonizingly slow to Elizabeth in her current state. "Left 10 minutes ago, miss. Last train of the day. The morning express leaves at 7:15 tomorrow." Elizabeth glanced out the window and saw Robert Fletcher's tall figure approaching rapidly, his long stride eating up the distance between them. Behind him was Caldwell, and behind Caldwell, two men she didn't recognize but who moved with purpose toward the station. "Please, I need your help. Those men pursuing me mean to do me harm." The station master peered past her, recognition dawning on his face. "That's Robert Fletcher, miss. A respected businessman. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Elizabeth insisted desperately. "Please, is there anywhere I can hide? A storage room, perhaps?" The old man hesitated, clearly torn between helping a distressed young woman and crossing one of Willowbrook's most prominent citizens. Before he could decide, the station door opened, and Robert Fletcher entered, followed by Caldwell and the two men Elizabeth had seen at the cemetery. "Ah, Miss Harrow," Robert said smoothly. "We were concerned when you ran off like that. Mr. Caldwell was just saying you've been working too hard lately. Overwrought, perhaps." The station master relaxed visibly. "Evening, Mr. Fletcher." The young lady seemed distressed. "Said you meant her harm." Robert chuckled indulgently. "Poor Elizabeth has been having episodes, imagining things. We're taking her to see Dr. Phillips." Elizabeth backed away, clutching the photographic plate. "Don't listen to him. They've done something terrible. Look at this." She began to withdraw the plate from her pocket. Before she could reveal it, one of the men with Robert lunged forward and seized her arm. The plate slipped from her grasp and shattered on the station floor, fragments of glass scattering across the wooden planks. The image that might have provided proof of the Fletcher family's unnatural nature was destroyed in an instant. "No!" Elizabeth cried, dropping to her knees to gather the broken pieces. But it was hopeless. The plate was beyond repair, the evidence lost. "Clumsy," Robert said with false sympathy. "Now look what's happened. Come along, Elizabeth. Dr. Phillips is waiting." The station master watched uncertainly as the men led Elizabeth from the station, her struggles futile against their combined strength. As they forced her into a waiting carriage, Elizabeth caught a final glimpse of the broken plate on the station floor. The image lost forever. The carriage didn't take her to Dr. Phillips, of course. Elizabeth had known it wouldn't. Instead, it wound through the darkened streets to the Fletcher estate on the outskirts of town. The house loomed against the night sky, most windows dark except for a glow from what Elizabeth presumed was the parlor, the same room where Arthur Fletcher's body, or what she had believed to be his body, had lain in its casket just days before. She was escorted inside, her arms firmly gripped by Robert and one of the other men. Mrs. Fletcher awaited them in the parlor, dressed not in mourning clothes now, but in a deep burgundy gown that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. Her expression was cold as she regarded Elizabeth, any pretense of grief or fragility now abandoned. "So she wouldn't listen to reason, Mrs. Fletcher said, addressing her son rather than Elizabeth. "She was at the train station," Robert replied. "Planning to flee to Boston, I imagine, with evidence." He nodded toward Caldwell, who had followed them in. "Fortunately, the evidence is now destroyed." "With proof," Elizabeth added defiantly. "I had the photographic plate that showed whatever your husband, or whatever he was, really is." Mrs. Fletcher's lips curved in a thin smile. "And now you've lost it. How unfortunate. Though I doubt anyone would have believed you anyway. A hysterical young woman with wild tales of body snatching and immortality. You would have been committed to an asylum within the week. Others will notice I'm missing, Elizabeth said, though she knew it wasn't true. With no family in Willowbrook, she had few close connections beyond her employment at the studio. Her landlady might eventually report her absence, but by then, it would be too late. "Oh, you won't be missing," Caldwell said, entering the parlor behind them. "You'll be at work tomorrow, as usual. Perhaps a bit quiet, a bit different, but no one will suspect why." A cold dread settled in Elizabeth's stomach as she understood their implication. "You mean to take my body?" "Not I," Caldwell said. "I'm quite comfortable where I am for now, but we have another who needs a new vessel." On cue, the parlor door opened and Thomas Fletcher entered, Arthur's younger son, who had stood solemnly behind his mother at the funeral. But his movements were wrong somehow, stiff and awkward, as if he were unfamiliar with his own limbs. His eyes were glazed, unfocused, and his complexion had a grayish cast that had not been present at the funeral. "Father," Mrs. Fletcher said softly. Thomas Fletcher's face contorted in an approximation of a smile. "This body is rejecting me," he said, his voice a disturbing blend of Thomas's tenor and a deeper, more authoritative tone Elizabeth recognized from the few times she had spoken with Arthur Fletcher. "The transfer was incomplete. I need another vessel, quickly." Elizabeth struggled against her captors, but their grip was unyielding. "You're monsters," she spat. "All of you." "We are survivors," Mrs. Fletcher corrected. "My husband discovered the secret in Tibet in 1880. He shared it with me in 1890, when my first body began to fail. We've lived many lives since then, Elizabeth. We've seen the turn of a century, and we will see many more, God willing, while leaving a trail of empty husks behind you," Elizabeth said bitterly. "Innocent people whose lives you've stolen. Some were innocent," Robert acknowledged. "Others, like Caldwell, joined us willingly. He was Daniel Winters originally, you know. Agreed to the transfer when he discovered what my father could offer. Immortality has its price, but many find it worth paying." Elizabeth looked at Caldwell in horror. You're Daniel Winters? But the newspapers said he committed suicide." Caldwell, or the entity that had once been Daniel Winters, shrugged. "A convenient explanation for the discovery of a body that was no longer inhabited. I took Edward Caldwell's identity when he came to investigate Winters' death, a photographer from Philadelphia, curious about a colleague's demise. Quite fitting, really." "And Virginia?" Elizabeth asked, looking around for the Fletcher daughter. "Is she part of this too?" "My daughter remains conventional," Mrs. Fletcher said with a hint of disappointment. "She knows nothing of our true nature. She believes her father died of heart failure, and her brother is suffering from grief-induced melancholia. She's staying with friends in Boston until the funeral is further behind us." Elizabeth's mind raced, searching for some way out of her predicament. "The caretaker at the cemetery. He knows the truth. He'll tell others." "Ezra Jenkins is a drunk and a fool," Mrs. Fletcher said dismissively. "No one has believed his ramblings for years, and after tonight he won't be rambling anymore." Elizabeth felt sick. "You've killed him. He's served his purpose," Robert said simply. "As have you, Miss Harrow. The knowledge you've gained cannot be permitted to spread." The entity inhabiting Thomas Fletcher's body stepped forward, movements jerky and uncoordinated. "I cannot maintain control much longer. The transfer must happen now." Mrs. Fletcher nodded to the two men who had accompanied Robert to the station. They forced Elizabeth into a high-backed chair near the fireplace, securing her wrists to the arms with leather straps that had been prepared in advance. The clinical efficiency with which they worked suggested this was not the first time they had performed such a task. "You can't do this," Elizabeth pleaded, looking from face to face for any sign of human compassion. "This is murder." "This is transcendence," Mrs. Fletcher corrected, "and you should be honored. My husband has chosen you specifically, Elizabeth. Your body is young, healthy, skilled with photography. You will house his consciousness for many years to come." And Thomas and Arthur approached, his gait unsteady, his eyes now gleaming with an unnatural light. "Hold her still," he commanded. "The transfer requires direct contact." As they forced her head back against the chair, Elizabeth made one final, desperate attempt. "The photograph," she gasped. "It wasn't a flaw in the plate. It was proof that whatever you're doing isn't working anymore. Something is going wrong with the transfers." Her words gave them pause. Robert looked at his mother uncertainly. "What does she mean?" Elizabeth pressed her advantage. In the funeral photograph, Mr. Fletcher's eyes were open, but only sometimes. The image changed depending on who was looking at it. That's not possible with normal photography. Something is breaking down in your process. You're losing control. The thing that had been Arthur Fletcher, now partially inhabiting his son's body, snarled. She's stalling. Restrain her. But Robert hesitated. Father, what if she's right? The last transfer was incomplete. You couldn't fully leave the old body or fully enter Thomas. What if the process is failing? Impossible. Arthur Thomas spat. I've perfected it over decades. Then why did your eyes open in the casket? Elizabeth challenged. Why did the photograph capture it? Why can you not fully control Thomas's body? Mrs. Fletcher looked troubled now. Arthur, perhaps we should wait. Study the process further before attempting another transfer. There is no time. Arthur roared through Thomas's mouth. This vessel is failing. I need the girl now. He lunged toward Elizabeth, his movements spasmodic. Thomas's face contorted in a mask of rage. Elizabeth tried to back away, but the restraints held her firmly in place. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for whatever was to come. What happened next occurred so quickly that Elizabeth could later barely recall the sequence of events. Thomas Arthur reached for her, his fingers like claws aimed at her face. At the same moment, Robert moved to intercept his father, perhaps to reason with him, or perhaps to protect Elizabeth. She would never know for certain. The two men collided, and Thomas Arthur lost his already precarious balance. He fell backward, striking his head against the marble fireplace with a sickening crack. Blood pooled rapidly beneath Thomas Fletcher's head as he lay motionless on the parlor floor. Mrs. Fletcher screamed, a sound of genuine anguish that made Elizabeth think that whatever else the woman was, she had truly loved her husband, or the thing he had become. In the confusion, Elizabeth wrenched one hand free of its restraint, the leather strap tearing under the force of her desperate pull. Before anyone could stop her, she reached for the letter opener on the small table beside her chair and slashed at the remaining strap. Then she was on her feet, backing away from the chaos unfolding before her. Robert knelt beside his brother's body, his face a mask of horror. Father, can you hear me? Mrs. Fletcher cradled Thomas's head in her lap, heedless of the blood soaking into her burgundy gown. Arthur, hold on. We'll find you another vessel. Hold on. Caldwell and the two other men stood frozen, seemingly uncertain whether to pursue Elizabeth or assist the Fletchers. Elizabeth used their moment of indecision to bolt for the door. No one pursued her immediately, all attention focused on the fallen Thomas Arthur. She ran through the darkened house, finding her way to the front entrance and out into the night. The rain had stopped, and a pale moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting an eerie silver light over the landscape. Elizabeth ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to collapse beneath her. She found herself at the edge of town, near the cemetery where she had spoken with Ezra Jenkins only hours before. Had they really killed the old caretaker? Or had that been an empty threat? She needed to hide, to plan her next move. Without the photographic plate, she had no proof of the Fletcher family's unnatural existence. No one would believe her wild tale of body snatching and century-old consciousnesses. The caretaker's cottage at the cemetery entrance was dark now. Elizabeth approached cautiously, listening for any sound that might indicate occupation. Hearing nothing, she tried the door and found it unlocked. Inside, a single room served as both living quarters and office for the cemetery caretaker. A narrow cot stood against one wall, a small stove against another. A desk piled with ledgers occupied one corner, and beside it, a cabinet that presumably held records of the cemetery's occupants. There was no sign of violence, no indication that Ezra Jenkins had met with foul play. Perhaps he had fled after his confrontation with Robert Fletcher, or perhaps he was already dead, his body hidden somewhere on the extensive cemetery grounds. Elizabeth sank onto the cot, exhaustion finally overtaking her. She had been awake for nearly 24 hours, and the strain of the day's events had left her physically and emotionally drained. She would rest for just a moment, she decided, and then continue her flight from Willowbrook. Despite her resolve, Elizabeth fell into a deep sleep, her body's need for rest overwhelming her fear. She dreamed of photographs where the subjects moved and changed, their eyes following her as she tried to escape from an endless gallery of portraits. In her dream, Edward Caldwell, or Daniel Winters, or whoever he truly was, stood in a dark room, dipping blank plates into chemical baths from which emerged not images but living beings, stepping out of the trays fully formed but somehow hollow, mere shells waiting to be inhabited. She woke with a start as the first light of dawn filtered through the cottage's single window. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure where she was or how she had come to be there. Then the events of the previous day crashed back upon her with sickening clarity. As dawn broke over Willowbrook, Elizabeth made her decision. She would return to the photography studio one last time. If she couldn't take evidence with her, she would create it. A final record of the truth before she fled Willowbrook forever. The town was quiet in the early morning light as Elizabeth made her way cautiously to Caldwell Photography Studio. A few early risers were about, a baker opening his shop, a milkman making his rounds, a street sweeper clearing the previous day's debris from the cobblestones. None paid particular attention to Elizabeth, who kept her head down and her pace measured despite the urgency she felt. She used her key to enter, half expecting to find Caldwell waiting for her, but the studio was empty. The events at the Fletcher mansion must have kept him occupied through the night. Elizabeth worked quickly, gathering the supplies she needed: a camera, plates, chemicals. She wrote a detailed account of everything she had discovered, from the funeral photograph to the Fletcher's confession at the mansion. Her hand trembled at times, but her determination never wavered. When she had finished, Elizabeth took a self-portrait, a photograph of herself holding her written testimony. She had to work quickly, setting up the camera with its self-timer, arranging herself in the frame, and then developing the plate immediately. She worked with the efficiency born of 3 years' experience under Caldwell's tutelage, grateful now for the skills that might save her life or at least ensure that the truth survived even if she did not. Once the photograph was fixed and dried, she made multiple copies, each labeled clearly, "The Truth About the Fletcher Family," by Elizabeth Harrow, May 1909. She wrote on the back of each print a summary of what she had discovered: the body switching, the murders, Caldwell's true identity. If anything happened to her, if she disappeared like Dr. Abernathy or died mysteriously like Daniel Winters, there would be evidence of what had occurred. She packaged the photographs and her written account, addressing them to newspapers in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. One package she addressed to her cousin Margaret, with specific instructions to publish the contents if anything happened to her. She included a personal note to Margaret, explaining that if she didn't hear from Elizabeth within a week, she should assume the worst and take the evidence to the authorities. With the packages prepared, Elizabeth made one more photograph, a copy of the studio ledger that recorded all of Caldwell's assignments for the past 3 years. The ledger included entries for photographs of Arthur Fletcher's mill, Dr. Abernathy's house call to the Fletcher estate, and most recently, the funeral portrait. It wasn't proof in itself, but combined with her testimony, it might help establish a pattern that investigators could follow. As she left the studio for the last time, packages tucked securely in her bag, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of calm. She might not escape Willowbrook alive, but the truth would survive her. Someone would investigate. Someone would discover what the Fletchers, and how many others like them, had been doing for decades. The post office wouldn't open for another hour, but Elizabeth knew the back entrance where mail was sorted would be accessible to workers already. She made her way there, finding a young clerk she recognized preparing the day's deliveries. "Miss Harrow," he said, surprised to see her so early. "Can I help you?" "These need to go out on the morning train," Elizabeth said, handing him the packages. "It's most urgent." The clerk examined the addresses. "Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Important business?" "The most important," Elizabeth said. "Please, make sure they go today." She pressed a coin into his hand, more than the postage required, a bribe to ensure his cooperation. The young man nodded, understanding the unspoken message. "They'll be on the train, miss. You have my word." With that task accomplished, Elizabeth's next destination was clear. The morning train to Boston would depart in less than an hour. She made her way toward the station, vigilant for any sign of pursuit. The streets were beginning to fill with early workers, and she took comfort in the ordinary faces around her. The shopkeepers opening their stores, the schoolchildren with their books, the office clerks hurrying to their desks. The normalcy of Willowbrook in the morning light made the events of the previous night seem almost dreamlike, a fantasy born of overwrought nerves and too many Gothic novels. But as she approached the station, Elizabeth saw a familiar figure waiting on the platform: Robert Fletcher, looking composed despite the events of the previous night. There was no sign of blood on his immaculate suit, no indication that his brother lay dead or dying at the family mansion. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, scanning the approaching passengers with the air of a man expecting someone. Their eyes met across the distance, and Robert inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her presence. He made no move toward her, but his message was clear. There was nowhere she could run that they couldn't follow. Elizabeth hesitated, then continued forward. Whatever awaited her, she would face it with courage. She had done all she could to expose the truth. The rest was in God's hands. As she purchased her ticket, Elizabeth noticed a newspaper on the counter, the morning edition of the Willowbrook Gazette. The headline made her blood freeze. Tragic accident at Fletcher Estate. Thomas Fletcher dies in fall. Father suffers stroke. In a double tragedy for one of Willowbrook's most prominent families, Thomas Fletcher, 29, died last night after a fall at the family home. His father, Arthur Fletcher, who had been recovering from a recent illness, suffered a catastrophic stroke upon learning of his son's death and is not expected to survive. Mrs. Fletcher requests privacy during this difficult time. Elizabeth stared at the paper, understanding dawning. They had created a new narrative, a way to explain Thomas's death and to stage another death for Arthur Fletcher. Would he emerge again in a new body? Or had Elizabeth's suspicions been correct? Was the process failing? Terrible business with the Fletchers, the ticket seller commented, noting her interest in the headline. First the father, now the son. They say Mrs. Fletcher is beside herself with grief. Yes, Elizabeth managed to say. Terrible indeed. Train to Boston departing from Platform 1, called the station master. All aboard. Elizabeth gathered her belongings and moved toward the platform. As she boarded the train, she allowed herself one last look at Willowbrook, the place that had been her home for 3 years, now transformed in her eyes into something sinister and alien. Robert Fletcher still stood on the platform, watching her. Beside him now was Edward Caldwell, his expression impassive. As the train began to move, Elizabeth thought she saw something shift in Caldwell's features, a momentary slipping of the human mask to reveal something else beneath. Elizabeth turned away, focusing on the journey ahead. She had mailed her packages before coming to the station. The truth was out of her hands now, traveling to those who might believe, might investigate. All she could do was put as much distance as possible between herself and Willowbrook. The train gathered speed, carrying her away from the town and its secrets. Elizabeth didn't know what awaited her in Boston, whether the Fletcher family's influence extended that far, or whether she would find safety with her cousin Margaret. But she had done what she could to ensure that the truth about the funeral photograph, the dead man who looked directly at the camera, would not remain buried forever. As the landscape outside her window transformed from the familiar streets of Willowbrook to the rolling countryside beyond, Elizabeth closed her eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Her last conscious thought was of the glass plate that had shattered on the station floor, the proof she had lost, but perhaps not forever. For somewhere in Willowbrook, other photographs existed, other evidence of the unnatural thing that the Fletchers had become. And one day, someone else would notice a dead man's eyes open in a photograph staring directly at the camera, and the cycle would begin again. Months later, in a quiet Boston apartment, Margaret Harrow received a letter. It was from a law firm in Willowbrook, informing her that her cousin Elizabeth had been declared missing and presumed dead. The letter explained that Elizabeth had apparently boarded a train to Boston in May, but had never arrived at her destination. The law firm was settling her modest estate and wished to know if Margaret would claim Elizabeth's personal effects. Margaret wrote back immediately, expressing her shock and asking for details about the investigation into her cousin's disappearance. She mentioned the strange packages Elizabeth had sent just before she vanished, the photographs and written account of the Fletcher family's supposed unnatural abilities. The response came 2 weeks later, not from the law firm, but from Robert Fletcher himself. The letter was polite, sympathetic, explaining that a thorough investigation had found no evidence of foul play. Elizabeth had been under tremendous strain following the deaths of her parents, he wrote, and had shown signs of mental instability in her final days. The packages Margaret had received were, sadly, evidence of her cousin's deteriorating mental state, fantasies born of grief and overwork. Robert Fletcher offered to purchase the photographs and written materials to spare the family further pain. He named a sum that would have paid Margaret's rent for 5 years. Margaret declined. She kept Elizabeth's account and the photographs in a locked drawer, occasionally taking them out to study the image of her cousin, holding her testimony, the fear and determination in her eyes all too real. And sometimes when the light hit the photograph just right, Margaret thought she could see something strange in the shadows behind Elizabeth, a figure that wasn't quite human, watching. In Willowbrook, life continued as it always had. The Fletcher lumber mill remained the town's primary employer. Mrs. Fletcher emerged from mourning after a suitable period and resumed her social activities. Robert Fletcher married the daughter of a banker from a neighboring town, and they had a son whom they named Arthur, after his grandfather. And at Caldwell Photography Studio, a new assistant was hired, a young woman with skilled hands and an eye for composition. Customers sometimes remarked on a certain familiarity about her, though they couldn't quite place it. She had a habit of studying them intently through the camera lens, as though looking not at them, but into them, assessing their suitability for something beyond a mere photograph. On the wall of the studio hung a portrait of the previous assistant, Elizabeth Harrow, preserved as a memorial to an employee who had left town under tragic and mysterious circumstances. In the photograph, Elizabeth stared directly at the camera, her expression solemn, her eyes strangely alive, watching, always watching.